Caroline Miller never thought that the day before her own wedding, she would be standing at the entrance of her office building, staring into the face of a person she hadn't seen in 20 years. Her father, Robert Miller. The same man who, one morning, simply didn't come home, leaving a 5-year-old girl and her mother alone with an empty refrigerator and a stack of unpaid bills. He was standing near the service entrance, leaning against the wall of a gray brick building. The September sun was in his eyes, and at first, Caroline didn't understand who it was. Just a silhouette, a man in his early 60 seconds in a faded jacket with a short, graying haircut. Then he took a step forward, and she saw his face. Recognition hit her like a punch to the gut. The same eyes, the same gaze, only with wrinkles, so many wrinkles, and a strange weariness about his entire appearance. "Caroline," he said softly. "Wait. Just listen to me." Caroline stopped. Not because she wanted to, but because her legs simply stopped obeying her. For 20 years, she had imagined this meeting. For 20 years, she had rehearsed the words she would throw in his face. But now all those words had vanished, dissolving into the air and the silence between them. "There's no justification for what I did," her father said. His voice was steady, without a tremor, without tears. "But that's not what this is about right now." Caroline let out a bitter laugh. She looked at him in disbelief. "Not what this is about? Seriously? You show up here after 2 decades to tell me that's not what this is about?" He didn't look away, didn't try to make excuses. He just stood there, as if he knew he had exactly 1 minute and that spending it on apologies was pointless. "Tomorrow," he said slowly, enunciating each word. "When you leave City Hall, a black SUV with a white ribbon on the hood will pull up. Do not get in it. Under any circumstances." Caroline raised her eyebrows. This was so unexpected that she couldn't immediately find a response. "What?" "Do not get into the car that comes for you," her father repeated. "I'll be waiting around the corner. Just trust me." "Trust you?" Caroline burst out laughing. The laugh was hysterical, harsh. "Do you even understand how absurd this is? You abandoned Mom and me when I was 5 years old, 20 years without a word. And now you show up on the eve of the most important day of my life and start talking nonsense about an SUV?" Her father remained silent. His face was impenetrable. No emotion, no attempt to appeal to her. He didn't reach out his hand, didn't take a step forward. He just stood there, looking at her as if he knew she wouldn't believe him anyway. "Did you hear me?" he finally asked. "I heard you," Caroline replied sharply. "And you know what? I want you to leave. I don't know why you came here. Maybe your conscience finally kicked in, or maybe you just got bored. But I'm not interested. I have my wedding tomorrow. Do you understand? My wedding, and I'm not going to spend another minute of my time on you." She turned and walked toward the entrance, quickly, almost at a run. Her heart was pounding, her temples throbbed, her hands were clumsy as she swiped her ID card at the turnstile. Her father didn't call out to her, didn't run after her. When Caroline glanced back from the elevator, his silhouette was still visible at the entrance. He just stood there, watching her go. Then he turned and walked away slowly. Caroline went up to her office and locked herself in the bathroom. She sat on the toilet lid and buried her face in her hands. She didn't cry. She just sat there, trying to calm her breathing. Black SUV. White ribbon. Don't get in. How absurd was that? What was he even talking about? Caroline took out her phone and stared at the screen. In the photo, Dan, her fiancé, her future husband, was smiling. Tomorrow, at exactly 11 a.m., they would become husband and wife, and no black SUV and no long-lost father was going to ruin that day. She wiped her face, fixed her hair, and walked out of the bathroom. "Caroline, why are you so pale?" asked her colleague, Christine, meeting her by the water cooler. "I'm fine, just nerves. Tomorrow's the big day. I get it. I didn't sleep for 3 nights before my wedding, but it all works out. You'll see." Caroline nodded and went back to her desk. The rest of the day passed in a sort of fog. She tried to focus on work, but her thoughts kept returning to the encounter with her father. Why now? Why today? That evening, when Caroline got home, she saw Dan was already there. He was sitting in the kitchen, scrolling through something on his phone and frowning. "Hey," she said, kissing him on the cheek. "Did something happen?" No, everything's fine. Mom just called. She started in again about the reception hall, says we should have picked a bigger restaurant. Caroline smiled wryly. Beatrice Foster, Dan's mother, was a domineering and stubborn woman. From the moment Dan proposed, she had tried to control every aspect of the wedding. The choice of dress, the menu, the guest list, she stuck her nose in everything. Dan, this is our wedding, Caroline reminded him gently. Not hers. I know. That's just how she is. Well, forget it. Tomorrow, everything will be perfect. He hugged her, and Caroline leaned against him. Warm, reliable, her Dan. The man who had burst into her life 3 years ago and turned it upside down. Successful, self-assured, with his own business, a construction company his late father had founded, which brought in a stable income. Not millions, but enough to live comfortably. Dan, Caroline began quietly. What if something went wrong tomorrow? Like what? Exactly? He pulled back slightly, looking at her with concern. Well, I don't know. Just sometimes things happen. Caroline, what are you talking about? Are you getting pre-wedding jitters? No, it's nothing. Just nerves. It's silly. She didn't tell him about her father. What was the point? To ruin Dan's mood the night before the wedding? To make him start asking questions she had no answers to? They had dinner, watched a movie, and then Dan left for his mother's house. A tradition before the wedding. Caroline had trouble falling asleep. She lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying her father's words in her mind. Black SUV, white ribbon. Don't get in. Why had he said it with such certainty? Why didn't he try to explain or justify himself? He just said it and left, as if he knew he didn't need to say anything else. The next morning, Caroline woke to the sound of her alarm. 7 o'clock, her wedding day. She lay in bed for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, then sat up sharply and stretched. Nerves, adrenaline, anticipation. Dan had left for his mother's house during the night. It was tradition not to see the bride before the ceremony. Caroline was home alone. She took a long shower, dried her hair, curled it, sprayed it with hairspray, and did her makeup. The dress hung on a hanger by the window, white, elegant, without any fuss. Caroline didn't like puffy outfits. She liked things that were sleek and tasteful. At 9, her friend Emily, the maid of honor, arrived. She brought the bouquet, champagne, and a stream of enthusiastic compliments. You look so beautiful. Dan is going to faint when he sees you. Caroline smiled. Inside, she was a bundle of excitement. A good excitement, the right kind, the kind you feel before something important and long awaited. They drank a glass of champagne, laughed, and took a ton of pictures. Emily helped pin the veil into Caroline's hair. Then the white limo, decorated with ribbons and flowers, arrived. The wedding procession, everything as it should be. City Hall was in the center of the city, in a historic building with grand columns. When they arrived, guests were already gathered on the steps, relatives, friends, colleagues, all dressed up and smiling. Dan was standing on the steps in a black tuxedo, tall, distinguished, with that characteristic, confident smile of his. Caroline stepped out of the limo, and he moved toward her. "You are absolutely beautiful. God, I have no words," he whispered, taking her hand. The ceremony went off without a hitch. Vows, rings, a kiss, applause, congratulations. Guests surrounded them, throwing confetti, shouting, "Kiss!" The photographer's camera clicked non-stop. Caroline laughed, hugged Dan, and tossed the bouquet, which one of the bridesmaids caught with an enthusiastic shriek. It was all like a fairy tale, exactly as she had imagined. Then they went outside. The guests started getting into their cars. Some had already left for the restaurant where the reception was being held. The photographer pulled Dan aside to discuss some details for the photo shoot, the route, the angles. He stepped to the side, gesturing and explaining something. Caroline stood at the entrance of City Hall, holding a small white purse and smiling. Emily had slipped away to touch up her makeup. A crowd bustled around, but for a moment, Caroline was alone. And then, a black SUV pulled up to the curb. With a white ribbon on the hood, Caroline's heart stopped. She stared at the vehicle, unable to believe her eyes. This couldn't be happening. It was a coincidence, a normal car, a normal white ribbon. A man in a dark suit got out of the driver's door. He approached Caroline and nodded politely. "Caroline Miller?" She nodded, unable to speak. "You're requested to ride separately." "Dan will be along later," he said. "He said it's a surprise." The driver's voice was firm, calm, professional. He opened the back door, and Caroline saw the interior. Leather seats, and a woman sitting in the back, elegant, in her 50s, wearing a tailored suit. On the seat in front of her was a folder with documents. "Good morning," the woman said with a smile. "My name is Sylvia Vance. I'm the family's attorney. We need to discuss a couple of formalities on the way to the restaurant. It won't take long." Caroline froze. Everything inside her screamed. Everything her father had said had come true. Black SUV, white ribbon, an attorney, documents. "Caroline?" the woman called, frowning slightly. "Is everything all right?" Caroline turned sharply. Dan was still a short distance away, talking to the photographer. Emily was nowhere to be seen. The guests had dispersed. No one saw what was happening. And then she remembered not her father's words, but his tone, that firm, confident tone, without pleading or mystery, just a statement of fact. "Do not get in." Caroline took a step back. "Excuse me," she said. "I need to get something. Just a minute." She turned and walked quickly away from the SUV. Not running, that would be too obvious, just a brisk walk. She rounded the City Hall building, turned the corner, and there, leaning against an old Ford Taurus, was her father. Their eyes met, and Caroline understood. He knew exactly what would happen. "Let's go," her father said, opening the car door. "I'll explain on the way." Caroline looked at him, then glanced back. From around the corner, she heard the sound of an engine starting. The SUV was leaving. Without her, she got into her father's car. Her hands were shaking, her whole body was tense like a wire. Robert started the engine and pulled out smoothly. He was silent, not rushing her. Caroline stared out the window, trying to organize her thoughts. "How did you know?" she finally managed to say. Her father silently pulled a folded sheet of paper from his jacket pocket and handed it to her. Caroline unfolded it. It was a printout of a car service request. Date, 1 week ago. Client, Prima Consulting, LLC. Description, SUV, no company logos. Route, Post City Hall via the Industrial Park. In the comments, in small print, bride rides alone. Attorney with documents will be in the vehicle. Driver is not to interfere. Caroline read it 3 times, then she looked up at her father. "What does this mean?" "It means," Robert answered in a steady voice, "that they wanted to take you somewhere quiet and make you sign papers." While all the guests are at the restaurant, while the groom is waiting, his mother would tell him it was some kind of surprise. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, it would be too late. Caroline froze. "Who ordered this car?" Robert didn't answer right away, just kept his eyes on the road. Then he said quietly, "Your brand new mother-in-law." Caroline sat in her father's car, staring at the printout he'd given her. The letters blurred before her eyes. She read the lines over and over, trying to find some mistake, some explanation that would make it all less terrifying. Bride rides alone. Attorney with documents will be in the vehicle. Driver is not to interfere. "Beatrice?" Caroline asked, looking up at her father. "Are you sure?" Robert nodded. He drove the car calmly, unhurriedly. They were heading somewhere on the outskirts of the city, past residential neighborhoods and shopping centers. "I checked the client. Prima Consulting, LLC, is registered under Beatrice Foster's name. She opened it 2 years ago. Officially, it's a consulting firm, but in reality, the company is barely active. Minimal tax filings. They use it for one-off transactions." Caroline listened, unable to believe it. Beatrice, Dan's mother, the woman who told stories about his childhood at family dinners, baked pies, and called Caroline sweetie. "How did you even see this request?" Caroline asked. "Are you a driver?" "No, a dispatcher," her father corrected. "For the last 5 years, I've worked as a dispatcher at Elite Executive Transport. We handle VIP clients, weddings, corporate events, business trips. I receive requests, assign cars, and monitor routes." He fell silent, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Caroline saw his shoulders tense. "This request came in a week ago," Robert continued. "Seemed normal at first glance. An SUV for a wedding. But I always read the comments. It's part of the job. And when I saw that line about the bride and the documents, something clicked. It was too strange. Why take the bride alone? Why an attorney in a wedding car?" Caroline was silent. Her father went on. "I checked the wedding date, then the bride's name, Caroline Miller. I didn't immediately realize it was you. The last name is ours, but when I saw it, I decided to check just in case. Caroline, I know I have no right to show up in your life, but I couldn't just stand by." His voice didn't waver. No tears, no excuses, just cold, hard facts. Caroline realized that was what was most frightening. Her father wasn't trying to evoke pity. He was simply doing what he felt was necessary. "I started digging deeper," Robert said. "I checked the client, which led me to Beatrice Foster. Then I found information about her son, Daniel Foster, owner of a construction company. I looked at public data on his business. Caroline, he's in trouble. Serious trouble." Caroline's heart skipped a beat. "What kind of trouble?" "Debt. Massive debt. His company took out loans for development 2 years ago. Several large projects fell through. Clients backed out of contracts. One of them went bankrupt. In the end, Dan was left with unfinished projects and loans he can't repay. The banks are demanding payment. If he doesn't find the money in the next 6 months, his company will go under." Caroline stared at her father. "How do you know this?" "I have an acquaintance who works in the credit department at one of the banks. I asked him to check unofficially. He confirmed it. Daniel Foster is on the verge of collapse." Caroline shook her head. "That's impossible. Dan never said anything to me. We've been together for 3 years. He would have told me if he had problems like that." "Maybe he didn't want to worry you," Robert suggested. "Or he hoped it would all resolve itself. But it seems his mother decided to take matters into her own hands." Caroline was silent. Thoughts swirled in her head. Dan, debt, Beatrice, documents in the SUV. "What documents did she want me to sign?" Caroline asked in a low voice. "I don't know for sure," her father admitted, "but judging by everything, something related to financial obligations. A guarantee. Power of attorney. Consent to joint liability for debts. After the marriage license is signed, you become his wife. Documents signed by you become legally binding, and you're automatically drawn into his financial problems." Caroline felt a chill run down her spine. "So, they wanted to use me? To cover Dan's debts?" "Most likely, yes. Beatrice is a savvy woman. She knows how these schemes work. Take you to a quiet place while all the guests are at the reception. The lawyer explains it's a formality, that it's standard procedure, that everyone does it. You sign without even reading, and then it turns out you're now responsible for millions in debt." Caroline covered her face with her hands. It was too much, too terrifying, too vile. "And what could they even get from me?" she asked, lowering her hands and looking at her father. "I work in procurement. The salary is good, but not astronomical. I don't have a business, no major savings. What good am I to them?" Robert gave her a long look. Then he said quietly, "Caroline, you inherited a 2-bedroom condo from your mother, 1,000 square feet in a good neighborhood. Do you remember what it's worth?" Caroline's mind went blank. The condo, the very same one she grew up in, where her mother spent the last years of her life. After her mother's death, the condo passed to Caroline. She lived in it now. Dan had moved in with her. "Around $750,000, she answered slowly. $750, maybe $800,000 at current market prices, Robert specified. "And that's not all. You have a lake house in Michigan you inherited from your grandmother, a plot of land on the water. House, dock, garden. When was the last time you were there?" Caroline remembered the lake house, a small cottage with carved trim, an orchard of apple trees, a nearby river. Her grandmother had died 8 years ago and left the house to her. Caroline rarely went. She never had time, but the place was well kept. The neighbors looked after the property in exchange for keeping what they grew. "A couple of years ago," she admitted. "It's in good shape. The neighbors watch it." "That lake house is worth around $350,000 now," Robert said. "Maybe more. Land prices in that area have shot up since they ran gas lines and repaved the road. Developers are buying up land for new communities. Caroline felt her mouth go dry. $800,000 for the condo, $350,000 for the lake house. That was over $1 million. It would be more than enough to completely pay off Dan's debt. My God, she whispered. They wanted access to my property. Exactly, Robert nodded. The documents they would have given you in that car would have given Dan or his mother the right to dispose of your property in case of financial difficulties. Formally, it would look like a joint decision by the spouses. In reality, your condo and your lake house would become collateral for Dan's debts. Caroline stared at her father. So if Dan couldn't pay the loan, the bank could take my condo? And the lake house? Not the bank. Exactly, Robert corrected. The bank wouldn't have direct access to your property, but according to those documents you would have signed, Dan or his authorized representatives would get the right to sell your real estate to pay off the debts. And the authorized person would most likely be Beatrice. You would have signed the papers without even knowing you were handing over control of your property. Why didn't you go to the police? She asked, lowering her hands. Why not just report all of this? Because formally, no crime has been committed yet, Robert replied. A car request isn't a crime. An attorney in the vehicle isn't a crime. As long as you didn't get in that car, as long as they didn't take you away, as long as you didn't sign anything, there's no crime. The police wouldn't have even considered such a report. At best, they would have advised you to be careful. Caroline exhaled. The logic was ironclad and terrifying. So I was just supposed to trust you, she said. A person who abandoned me 20 years ago. Her father was silent. He pulled into a side street and stopped the car near a small diner. Come on, he said. You need to pull yourself together. Then you can decide what to do. They went into the nearly empty diner, with only a couple of customers by the window. Robert ordered 2 coffees and sat across from his daughter at a corner table. Caroline looked at him, trying to understand what she felt. Anger, gratitude, fear, all at once. Why did you leave? She asked suddenly. 20 years ago. Why did you just disappear? Robert picked up his coffee cup and took a sip. His face remained impassive. I was weak, he said simply. Work wasn't going well. Money was tight. Your mother was constantly nagging me. I couldn't handle it, so I left. It was the worst thing I ever did in my life. Caroline waited for him to continue. He didn't. And that's it? She asked. You just left? And that's all? That's all, Robert confirmed. There are no excuses. There weren't then, and there aren't now. Caroline gripped her cup. Strangely, this stark honesty was more calming than any tearful apology would have been. Mom died 10 years ago, Caroline said. Cancer. She worked until the very end to provide for me. You probably didn't even know. I knew, her father replied quietly. I found out about 6 months after she died, from old acquaintances. I wanted to visit the cemetery, but I didn't have the courage. Caroline looked at him, not knowing what to say. Should she be angry? Forgive him? Push him away? Why are you keeping tabs on my life anyway? She asked. I'm not, Robert objected. I just hear things sometimes, by chance. The city isn't that big. Mutual acquaintances. I knew you worked in procurement at a good company, that you were doing well. That was enough for me. Caroline exhaled. So what do I do now? Go back to Dan and say, Hi, darling. Your mother tried to trick me and saddle me with your debts? That's your decision, Robert said. I can't decide for you, but you have the right to know the truth, and you have the right to demand an explanation. Caroline took out her phone. 12 missed calls, 8 from Dan, 3 from Emily, 1 from a colleague, even more text messages. Caroline, where are you? Answer. We're worried. Are you okay? She looked at her father. Dan is going crazy right now. Everyone at the restaurant is waiting. I have to call. Call. Robert nodded. Just think about what you're going to say. Caroline dialed Dan's number. He answered on the first ring. Caroline. God, where are you? I've been going out of my mind. Are you okay? His voice was filled with panic. Real, genuine panic. I'm fine. My phone died, Caroline said. Dan, I need to talk to you. Urgently. Alone. About what? What happened? You just left, and nobody knows where you went. Emily said you just disappeared. Dan, did you know that your mother ordered a separate car for me with a lawyer inside? Silence. Long, heavy silence. What? Dan finally managed to say. What car? What lawyer? A black SUV. Your mother ordered it through her company. It pulled up to City Hall right after the ceremony. The driver said you'd be along later, that it was a surprise. Inside was a woman who introduced herself as the family attorney. With documents. Another pause. Then, in a hollow voice, I didn't know anything about it. Are you sure, Dan? I swear, Caroline, I had no idea. What car? What lawyer? I didn't order anything like that. Caroline could hear the bewilderment in his voice, the shock. But was there a lie in there? Your mother ordered it, Caroline repeated. Through Prima Consulting, LLC. Her company. Dan was silent. Then, quietly, almost in a whisper, "Oh my God, Mom, she couldn't have done that." She could have, Caroline said harshly. And she did. Dan, are you in debt? Major debt with the business? The silence grew even heavier. How did you know? Dan finally managed. That doesn't matter. Answer the question. He sighed. A long, weary sigh. Yes, there are problems, serious problems. I was going to tell you after the wedding. I didn't want to ruin this day. And your mother knew. Of course she knew. She was trying to help me. She was looking for investors, suggesting different options. But I never thought. Caroline, I swear, I didn't know she planned this thing with the car. Caroline closed her eyes. Dan wasn't lying. She could hear it in his voice. He didn't know. But his mother knew. And she acted. Where are you now? Dan asked. At a diner on the outskirts. Send me the address. I'm coming right now. We'll talk about everything. Please. Caroline looked at her father. He gave a slight nod. Okay, Caroline said. Come, but come alone. Without your mother. Without my mother, Dan repeated. I promise. She hung up and looked at her father. He didn't know, Caroline said. I'm sure of it. He didn't know. Maybe, Robert conceded. But his mother definitely knew, and she acted with a clear purpose. Caroline nodded. 20 minutes later, Dan's car pulled up to the diner. He got out, looked around, and quickly came inside. He saw Caroline and stopped in his tracks. Then his gaze fell on the man sitting with her. Who is this? Dan asked, approaching the table. My father, Caroline replied. He's the one who warned me about the car. Don stared at Robert. Your father? The one who... Yes, Caroline interrupted. The one. He works as a dispatcher for the company that handled your mother's order. He saw the request and realized it was a trap. Dan slowly sat down in a chair. His face was pale. I didn't know, he repeated. I swear to you, Caroline, I didn't know a thing. But you're in debt, Caroline stated. Yes, Dan admitted. $1 million. The bank is demanding repayment. I tried to negotiate a restructuring, but they refused. I have 6 months. If I don't find the money, I'll lose everything. Caroline nodded. And your mother decided that I could be the solution to the problem. Dan sighed. I'm going to talk to her right now. This is unacceptable. You'll talk to her, Caroline agreed. But first, I need guarantees. I need to know there won't be any more surprises. And I want to see the documents she planned to give me. Dan nodded. You'll see them, I promise. Caroline, forgive me. Forgive me for not telling you sooner. I didn't want you to worry about the debts. These are my problems. Caroline looked at him. Then at her father. Then back at Dan. We're going to your mother right now, and she is going to explain everything, down to the last letter. Dan nodded. Let's go. The three of them left the diner. The wedding, which should have been the happiest day of her life, had turned into an interrogation. But Caroline knew. It was better to know the truth now than to live in a lie later. The two of them sat in Dan's car, Caroline in the passenger seat. Robert got into his own car, ready to follow the newlyweds. The silence was heavy, tense. Dan gripped the steering wheel. Where are we going? He asked, staring straight ahead. To the restaurant, Caroline replied. "Where our guests are waiting, and your mother." Dan nodded. He started the engine and pulled away. The city drifted by outside the window, bright storefronts, autumn trees, people on the sidewalks. A normal day for everyone else. But for Caroline, this day had turned everything upside down. "Are you sure you want to have this conversation there?" Dan asked. "In front of all the guests?" "Not in front of everyone," Caroline answered. "But I want her to understand. We know everything, and the games are over." Dan was silent for the rest of the drive. He just stared ahead, lost in his thoughts. The restaurant, the Golden Ballroom, was in the center of the city, in a historic mansion with columns and large windows. When they arrived, several cars from the wedding party were parked out front. The guests were already gathered inside, waiting for the reception to begin. Dan parked and turned off the engine. They sat in silence for a few seconds. "Ready?" Caroline asked. Dan exhaled. "Ready." They got out of the car and walked to the entrance. Caroline smoothed her dress, straightened her shoulders. Inside, she was a knot of tension, but she wouldn't allow herself to show weakness. Robert walked a little behind them, quiet and unobtrusive. In the lobby, they were met by the manager, a young woman in a black suit and white blouse. "Dan, Caroline, we were getting worried. The guests are waiting. The reception was supposed to start 20 minutes ago." "Sorry for the delay," Dan said. "There were some unforeseen circumstances. We'll be right in." They entered the banquet hall, a large room with high ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and long tables covered in snow-white tablecloths. The guests were seated at the tables, chatting and drinking champagne. When the newlyweds entered, everyone turned to them and applauded. "Kiss!" someone shouted. Dan and Caroline forced a smile. They kissed under the applause. Caroline quickly scanned the room. Emily was at a table to the right and waved. Caroline's colleagues were at the next table, Dan's relatives to the left. And right there, at the center of the relatives' table, sat Beatrice Foster, tall, distinguished, in a beige dress with a beautiful necklace. She looked at them, smiling, but her gaze was cool and composed. Caroline caught her eye. For a moment, Beatrice tensed, noticing the man who had entered behind the newlyweds. Robert stayed in the shadows, but his presence was palpable. "Dan," Caroline said in a low voice, "ask the manager for a private room. We need to talk to your mother alone." Dan nodded and went to the manager's desk. He returned a minute later. "They've given us the small parlor. It's quiet there. No one will bother us." Caroline walked over to the table where Beatrice was sitting. The guests around them were chatting and laughing, oblivious to the tension in the air. "Beatrice," Caroline said politely but firmly, "we need to speak with you. Now, in a private room." Beatrice raised an eyebrow. "Speak? Now?" "Caroline, we have a reception. The guests are waiting." "The guests will wait," Dan said coolly, coming up behind his mother. "Let's go. It's important." Beatrice looked at her son, then at Caroline, then at Robert, who stood a short distance away. Something in her expression shifted. She understood that something serious had happened. "Very well," she said, rising from the table. "Let's go." The four of them walked through the banquet hall toward the exit. The guests followed them with curious glances, but no one dared to ask what was happening. The manager led them to the small parlor, a cozy room with round tables, a few armchairs, and a large window overlooking the garden. Dan closed the door. Beatrice sat in one of the armchairs. Her face remained calm, but Caroline could see the tension in her posture. "I'm listening," Beatrice said in a firm tone. Dan walked over to her and leaned his hands on the back of the adjacent armchair. "Mom, did you order an SUV for Caroline? Through your company?" Beatrice didn't blink. "I did." "So what?" "With a lawyer inside. With documents." "Dan, I don't understand what these questions are about. Yes, I ordered a car. I wanted Caroline to arrive here comfortably, and Sylvia Vance is our family attorney. I asked her to prepare some documents for Caroline to sign." "What documents?" Caroline asked sharply, taking a step forward. Beatrice looked at her. Her gaze hardened. "Standard papers. Consent for joint ownership of assets. Power of attorney to represent the family's interests in financial matters. Normal formalities that all newlyweds sign." "That's a lie," Robert said calmly, stepping out of the shadows. Beatrice turned to him. Her eyes narrowed. "Excuse me, and who are you to interfere in our family's affairs?" "I'm the person who saw your car service request," Robert replied, pulling the folded sheet of paper from his pocket. "This doesn't look like standard formalities." He handed the printout to Dan. "Mom, is this?" Dan stammered. "Did you really plan this?" Beatrice was silent for a few seconds, then smirked. "You work for the transport company?" she asked Robert. "Yes, as a dispatcher." "And you decided to play the hero? Save the poor bride from the evil mother-in-law?" "I decided to warn my daughter that she was being deceived," Robert said in a firm voice. "Daughter? I thought Caroline was an orphan," Beatrice said, feigning surprise. She rose from the armchair, walked to the window, and looked out at the garden where the figures of guests who had stepped out for a smoke were visible among the trees. "Dan," she began without turning around, "your company is on the verge of bankruptcy. You know that. $1 million in debt. The bank is demanding repayment. You have no money, no assets you can sell. You're losing everything you've built over the last 5 years. Dan turned pale. "Mom, I'll handle it. I'll find a way out." "What way out?" Beatrice turned around. Her voice became hard, almost metallic. "You've been looking for investors for 6 months. No one wants to invest in a sinking ship. The bank won't give you an extension. In 3 months, bankruptcy proceedings will begin. You'll be left with nothing." "And you decided Caroline was the solution?" Dan raised his voice. "That if you saddled her with my debts, everything would be fine?" Beatrice held his gaze. "I decided to protect our family. If you're married, your wife bears part of the responsibility. That's what a family is. I wanted Caroline to sign documents that would distribute the financial obligations between you. It's standard practice." "Is it standard practice to deceptively lure the bride away and force her to sign papers without reading them?" Caroline asked coldly. Beatrice gave her a slight, condescending smile. "I wasn't going to force you. Sylvia would have explained everything. You would have signed voluntarily." "Voluntarily?" Caroline stepped forward. "Do you really think I would have agreed to take on millions in debt if I had known the truth?" "You love my son," Beatrice said. "Doesn't love imply a willingness to share his problems?" Caroline felt rage boiling inside her. "Love implies honesty, not schemes and manipulation." Beatrice smirked and walked back to the armchair but didn't sit. She stood, resting her hand on its back. "You're a naive little girl, Caroline. Do you think marriage is all about love and romance? Marriage is a business, a union of 2 families. And in this union, everyone must carry their share of the responsibility." "Mom, stop it!" Dan slammed his fist on the table. The sound echoed through the room, making everyone jump. "You're crossing every line. I didn't ask you to get involved. I didn't ask you to order that car." Beatrice turned to her son. Her face grew cold as ice. "You didn't ask because you're weak, Dan. You've always been weak. I raised you. I gave you an education. Your late father helped you start the business. And what did you do? You got into debt and now you're whining about your problems. I was trying to fix your mistakes. I was trying to save what's left." Dan was silent. "You wanted to use me," Caroline said, her voice low but clear, "and all of it without my real consent. You wanted to deceive me." "With your consent," Beatrice corrected, drawing herself up. "You would have signed the documents. Sylvia would have explained it to you in general terms." Robert took a step forward. His voice was calm, but there was steel in it. "That's called fraud, and you can go to prison for it." Beatrice laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "Prison? Are you serious? I didn't steal her money. I didn't threaten her. I just wanted her to sign a couple of papers, voluntarily." "Where's the crime?" "Documents signed under duress or deception can be challenged in court," Robert said, "especially if there's proof, and there is. The car request with the comments, witnesses, the driver, the very fact that you hired a lawyer specifically for this purpose." Beatrice stopped smiling. She looked at Robert intently, sizing him up. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm stating the facts," Robert replied calmly. "You tried to deceive my daughter, and it can be proven." Beatrice slowly sat down in the armchair. She folded her hands in her lap. Her face took on a thoughtful expression. "All right," she said after a pause. "Let's say you're right. Let's say I really did want Caroline to sign those papers. What are you going to do? Go to the police? Sue me? And what will that accomplish? Dan will still be in debt. You'll still live in constant fear that the bank will take everything. It will give me the security of knowing you won't try to deceive me again, Caroline said firmly, and it will give Dan an understanding of who he's dealing with. A mother who is willing to sacrifice his happiness for money. Dan stood silently, looking at his mother. Then, slowly, weighing each word, he said, I'm cutting all business ties with you. You no longer have anything to do with my company. You don't make decisions. You stay out of my life. Understood? Beatrice looked at her son as if he had slapped her. Her face twisted. A flash of pain appeared in her eyes, which she immediately hid behind a mask of coldness. You're choosing her over me? Her voice trembled with barely contained emotion. This little girl who doesn't even understand what she's gotten into? You're choosing her over the mother who dedicated her entire life to you? I'm choosing honesty, Dan replied firmly. I'm choosing to live without lies and manipulation. I'm choosing to build my family on trust, not deceit. And if you can't accept that, then yes, I'm choosing her. Beatrice stood up abruptly. Her eyes glistened, whether from tears or rage. You will regret this, Dan. When you're out on the street without a penny to your name, when the bank takes everything you have, you'll understand that I was right. You'll understand that I only wanted what was best for you. Maybe, Dan nodded, but at least I'll know that I took the honest path, that I didn't betray the person I love, that I didn't turn my wife into a hostage for someone else's debts. Caroline took Dan's hand and squeezed it tightly. He squeezed back, and in that grip, there was more support and love than in all the words in the world. It's time for us to go back to our guests, Caroline said, looking at Beatrice. But if you ever try to interfere in our lives again, if you try to manipulate or deceive us again, I will go to the police with all the evidence, and I will tell them everything. Beatrice was silent. She stood in the middle of the room, watching them leave with a stony expression. Her lips were pressed into a tight line. You can stay for the reception, Dan added at the door. Or you can leave. It's your choice. But as my mother, you no longer have the right to tell me how to live. They left the small parlor and closed the door behind them. They walked back down the hall to the banquet room. The guests greeted them with applause. Someone shouted, "Kiss," again. Dan and Caroline kissed, and the room erupted in laughter and more applause. Robert stopped at the entrance to the hall. "It's time for me to go," he said quietly to Caroline. "This is your party. I don't belong here." Caroline turned to him. "You do belong. You saved me. You saved both of us." Robert shook his head. "I just did what I had to do. Take care of yourself, Caroline. And him, too." He nodded toward Dan and headed for the exit. Caroline watched him go, feeling a strange warmth inside. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was the beginning of something new. The reception continued. Toasts, dancing, laughter. Beatrice never returned to the hall. One of the guests asked where she was, and Dan said she wasn't feeling well and had gone home. No one asked any more questions. Caroline danced with Dan to a slow song, thinking about what a strange day it had been, a wedding that almost became a trap, a father who appeared after 20 years of silence, a husband who turned out to be stronger and more honest than she had thought, and a mother-in-law who was willing to commit a crime to save what she considered important. "What are we going to do?" Caroline asked Dan, snuggling closer. "We'll figure it out." Dan kissed her on the lips. "We'll figure everything out, together." And in that moment, Caroline believed him. She truly believed him, because they had walked through fire on the very first day of their marriage, and they had survived. The reception ended late that night. The guests left, leaving behind empty glasses, crumpled napkins, and the atmosphere of a party that had happened despite everything. Caroline and Dan drove home in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The next morning began with a phone call. Dan answered it, standing in the kitchen with a cup of coffee. "Hello." "Yes, this is Dan Foster. We need to meet?" Dan stood motionless. It was the lawyer, Sylvia Vance, the same woman who had been in the SUV. "Why?" "I have something to tell you about yesterday's situation, and about your mother's plans. Let's meet at 2 p.m., at the cafe, by the theater." Dan looked at Caroline, who was standing in the doorway watching him. "All right," he agreed. "We'll be there." He hung up and turned to his wife. "Vance wants to meet. She says she'll tell us everything about my mother's plans." Caroline nodded. "Then we're going. And we're taking my father with us. He needs to hear this." At 2 o'clock, the three of them were sitting at a corner table in a small cafe downtown. Sylvia Vance arrived promptly, elegant, composed, with a leather briefcase in her hands. She sat down across from them and got straight to the point. "I want to apologize," she began, "for yesterday. I didn't know all the details. Beatrice Foster hired me as her attorney and asked me to prepare documents. She said it was a pre-arranged procedure." "And you believed her?" Caroline asked coldly. Sylvia held her gaze. "I'm a professional. I do what my clients ask, as long as it doesn't break the law." Beatrice presented the situation as a normal family agreement. But last night, she called me and said the plan had failed. That's when I understood I'd been used. "What plan?" Dan asked. Sylvia opened her briefcase and took out several documents. "These are the papers I was supposed to have you sign, Caroline." The first document, consent to act as a guarantor for Dan's credit obligations. The second, power of attorney for the right to manage your property in the family's favor. The third, an agreement of joint liability for all financial obligations. Caroline took the documents and began to read. With each line, her face grew paler. Dan snatched the papers from her hands and scanned the text. This is slavery," he breathed. "Mom wanted to make Caroline my financial slave." "Essentially, yes," Sylvia agreed. "These documents are drafted so that, formally, everything looks legal: voluntary consent, a signature, a date. But in reality, it's a trap. After signing, Caroline would bear full responsibility for your debts, Dan." Robert took the documents and studied them carefully. "Why did you come to us?" Caroline asked. "Why are you telling us this?" Sylvia paused. "Because I don't want to be part of a fraudulent scheme. I'm a lawyer with 20 years of experience. I have a reputation, and I'm not going to lose it over Beatrice Foster. Furthermore, she called me last night and demanded I destroy all copies of the documents. She said that if I told anyone, she would ruin my career. That was a threat, and I don't tolerate threats." "My God." "My mother is a criminal," Dan said. "Not exactly," Sylvia corrected. "Formally, she didn't commit a crime. She ordered a car, hired a lawyer, prepared documents. All of that is legal. The problem is that the documents were drafted with the intent to deceive, but proving that in court is difficult." "But not impossible," Robert said. "We have the car service request with the comments. There are witnesses. There are the documents themselves. That's enough to show intent." Sylvia nodded. "Yes. If you want to sue, you have a chance, but it will be a long and complicated process." Caroline looked at Dan. "How is your business? How bad is it?" Dan sighed. "Very bad. Debts. 3 unfinished projects. The bank is demanding repayment of the loan in 6 months. If I don't find the money, bankruptcy proceedings will begin. I'll lose the company, the equipment, everything." "And why didn't you tell me sooner?" Caroline asked quietly. Dan looked down. "I was ashamed. I thought I could handle it myself. I was looking for investors, trying to negotiate with the bank, exploring restructuring. Nothing worked. And then Mom said she had a plan. I didn't ask for details. I just hoped she'd figure something out. And she did," Caroline said with a bitter smile. "Use me as a financial safety net." Sylvia placed another document on the table. This is the bank statement for Dan's loan. It outlines all the terms, deadlines, and penalties. You should study this carefully. Dan took the statement and began to read. His face grew darker and darker. "It says here that if I miss the next payment in a month, the bank has the right to demand early repayment of the entire amount. And I can't make the payment. I don't have the money." Caroline looked at her father. Robert sat silently, listening intently. "What do you think?" she asked him. Robert thought for a moment. "I think the situation is serious, but solvable. Dan, do you have any assets? Real estate? Equipment? Anything else? There's an office downtown, 2 trucks, construction equipment, but if I sell that, I'll have nothing to work with." "And if you don't sell, bankruptcy will take everything," Robert pointed out. You need to calculate what's more advantageous. Sell some assets now and pay off at least part of the debt, or wait for bankruptcy and lose it all. Dan nodded. I understand. But even if I sell everything, it won't be enough to cover the whole loan. Sylvia interjected. You can try to negotiate a payment plan with the bank. If you show you're willing to cooperate, they might make concessions. I already tried, Dan said grimly. They refused, said there were too many risks. Caroline took his hand. Dan, what if we sell my condo? I can help. Dan looked at her sharply. No, absolutely not. I won't let you get dragged into this mess. We're husband and wife, Caroline reminded him. Your problems are my problems. Not in this case, Dan said firmly. I won't let you sacrifice your property for my mistakes. Robert cleared his throat. Then we need to act differently. Dan, you said you have 3 unfinished projects. Can you sell one of them? At least one, Dan thought. One project is about halfway done. It's a residential building. It just needs the interior finishing. If I can find a buyer willing to finish the project, I could get good money for it. How much? Robert asked. About $1.2 million. That's what you need. Robert nodded. Dan's spirits lifted. Yes, this could work. I need to find a buyer. Sylvia took out a business card and handed it to Dan. I have a client who works in real estate. He might be interested. Call him. Tell him I sent you. Dan took the card and nodded. Thank you. Sylvia gathered her documents and stood up. I have to go. If you need anything, call. I'm no longer working with Beatrice, so I can help you. They said their goodbyes. Sylvia left, leaving the 3 of them at the table. Caroline looked at Dan. We'll find a buyer. Dan nodded. Yes, it's the best thing we can do right now. Robert stood up. Well, I should be going. You 2 will manage. Caroline stood and hugged her father. Thank you. For everything. Robert awkwardly patted her on the back. If you need anything, call. I'll always be around. He left, and Caroline was alone with Dan. They sat in silence. Caroline, Dan began quietly, forgive me, for everything, for the debts, for my mother, for pulling you into this nightmare. Caroline took his hand. We'll get through it, together. Dan nodded. For the first time in 2 days, a faint smile appeared on his face. Together. That evening, Dan called Sylvia's client. He arranged a meeting for the next day. The man was indeed interested and promised to come see the property. Meanwhile, Caroline reached out to her colleagues at work. She asked if anyone knew someone who needed construction services. She found several contacts. They worked together like a team, and with each day, the situation began to look a little less hopeless. And Beatrice Foster sat in her house and understood that she had lost. Her son had cut ties with her. Her daughter-in-law knew the truth. The lawyer had switched sides. The scheme had collapsed, and now all she could do was watch as Dan tried to climb out of the hole she had dug for him. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur. Dan met with Sylvia Vance's client, showed him the unfinished project, and conducted negotiations. The buyer turned out to be a serious investor looking for promising projects. He agreed to buy the building for $1.2 million on the condition that Dan assist with the paperwork. The deal was closed quickly. The money was transferred to the account, and Dan immediately went to the bank and paid off the loan. When Dan walked out of the bank with the signed documents confirming the loan was paid off, he called Caroline. "It's done," he said, his voice trembling with relief. "The loan is closed." Caroline closed her eyes and exhaled. The tension of the past few weeks lifted from her shoulders like a heavy weight. "Dan, that's incredible. You did it." "We did it," he corrected. "Without you, without your father, without Sylvia, I couldn't have done it." That night, they sat in the kitchen making plans. Dan drew up a business plan for the next 2 years. Caroline helped, offering ideas and calculating figures. The 2 remaining projects could be completed with the new contacts she had found through her colleagues. One of them was already ready to sign a contract. "We need stability," Dan said. "No more risky projects, just reliable clients and clear deadlines." "Agreed," Caroline nodded. "And no more secrets between us. If problems arise, we talk about them immediately." Dan took her hand. "I promise." They sat in silence, enjoying a rare moment of peace. But this peace didn't last long. The next day, his mother called Dan. "We need to talk," Beatrice said in a cold tone. "About what?" Dan asked, tensing up. "About your future, and how you're going to pay off the debt without my help." "I've already paid off the debt," Dan replied. "I don't need your help." A pause. Then Beatrice said, "You sold the property on Stone Street? That building we started together?" "Yes. So what? That property was registered to a partnership that I partially funded. I have a stake in that company. You had no right to sell it without my consent." Dan froze. "What are you talking about? What stake? The company is mine." "Check the documents," Beatrice said icily. 3 years ago, I contributed capital to your partnership. You signed an agreement giving me a 20% stake. Did you forget?" Dan remembered. 3 years ago, when he was just starting to expand the business, his mother had indeed given him money. He had signed some papers without reading them closely. It had seemed like a formality at the time. "Mom, are you serious? You're going to challenge the deal?" "I want you to understand. Without me, you're nothing. You can't manage. You never could. And now you've gotten yourself into even bigger trouble by selling my asset without consent." Dan was furious. "It's not your asset, it's my company." "Check the documents," Beatrice repeated and hung up. Dan immediately called Sylvia Vance. She arrived within an hour, studied all the documents regarding the partnership, and confirmed his worst fears. Yes, Beatrice did indeed own 20% of the company, and by law, major transactions like selling real estate required the consent of all partners. You sold the property without her consent. She can challenge the deal in court. Dan sank into a chair and covered his face with his hands. "What do I do?" Sylvia thought. "There are 2 options. First, try to reach an agreement with Beatrice. Pay her compensation for her stake in the partnership. If she agrees, the matter is closed. And the second? The second is to prove that she has lost her right to participate in the management of the company due to dishonest conduct. The attempt to involve your wife in a fraudulent scheme could be an argument, but it's a long shot, and there's no guarantee the court will side with us." Dan looked at Caroline. "What do you think?" Caroline was silent for a few seconds, then said quietly, "I think we need to see this through to the end. Your mother tried to deceive me. She tried to use both of us. We need to put a stop to it." Dan nodded. "Then we prepare a lawsuit with all the evidence and show her how this could end if she continues to try to manipulate us." Sylvia agreed to take the case. She spent a week preparing the documents, gathering all the evidence of the fraudulent scheme. She drafted a detailed lawsuit demanding Beatrice's removal from the partnership based on dishonest conduct and abuse of a partner's rights. When everything was ready, Dan called his mother. "We need to meet," he said coolly. "I have some documents you need to see." Beatrice agreed. They met at the same cafe where they had recently met with Sylvia. Beatrice arrived alone, without a lawyer. She looked confident, even slightly arrogant. "I'm listening, Dan," she said, sitting at the table. "What did you want to show me?" Dan silently placed a thick folder in front of her. Beatrice opened it and began to read. With each page, her face grew paler. She went through the documents slowly, reading every word. The lawsuit was impeccably drafted. It detailed the scheme Beatrice had tried to execute, the preparation of documents that would make Caroline a co-debtor without her full understanding of the consequences. Attached were copies of the car service request with the damning comments, copies of the documents for signing, and a statement from Sylvia Vance, who was ready to testify against Beatrice. This was followed by the legal justification for the demand. Beatrice Foster had systematically abused her rights as a partner, acted in bad faith, and attempted to use her position to commit fraudulent acts. Such conduct was incompatible with partnership and damaged the company's reputation. At the end of the document was a legal assessment. With such evidence, a court would highly likely rule to remove the partner from the company without compensation for her stake. Moreover, Beatrice's actions could be classified as attempted fraud, which could lead to criminal prosecution. Beatrice finished reading and slowly closed the folder. Her hands were trembling slightly. She looked up at her son. "You're really prepared to sue me?" Her voice was low, but there was steel in it. "If you don't stop interfering in our lives, yes," Dan replied firmly. I gave you a chance. You crossed the line. Now you have a choice. Either you voluntarily exit the partnership, or we go to court. And then you'll not only lose your stake, but you'll also risk a criminal case." Beatrice was silent. She looked at the folder in front of her, then at her son. Rage and calculation warred in her eyes. "Do you understand what you're doing?" she asked. "You're turning your back on the mother who raised you your whole life, for some girl you barely know?" "I'm turning my back on the person who tried to destroy my family on the first day of our marriage," Dan replied. "Mom, I love you, but I will not allow you to manipulate me and my wife. You have 3 days to think about it. Either you sign the voluntary withdrawal agreement, or we file this lawsuit." Beatrice took the folder and rose from the table. "I'll think about it," she said coldly, and left the cafe. For 3 days, Dan waited for her response. Caroline supported him but saw how difficult this confrontation with his mother was for him. On the 3rd day, Beatrice called. "I agree," she said curtly. "Send the agreement. I'll sign it." Sylvia Vance quickly prepared the agreement for Beatrice's withdrawal from the partnership. Her stake was valued at its fair market price at the time of withdrawal. Beatrice signed the documents without another word, received the money, and disappeared from Dan's life. When it was all over, Dan sat on the balcony, looking out at the city. Caroline came out to him and put her arms around his shoulders. "Are you okay?" Dan nodded. "Yeah, it's just strange." She backed down on her own. She knew she would lose. "You gave her a choice," Caroline said softly. "A dignified way out. It was the right thing to do." "Yeah. But it's still hard." Caroline sat down next to him. "Dan, you did the right thing. You protected us. You protected our future. Sometimes you have to make tough decisions." Dan hugged her. "Thank you for being by my side, for believing in me." They sat in silence, watching the city lights come on. A few days later, Caroline met with her father. They arranged to meet at the same diner where it all began. Robert arrived on time. He sat across from his daughter and smiled. "I heard you worked things out." "Congratulations," Caroline nodded. "Thanks. None of this would have been possible without you." Robert shook his head. "You did it yourselves. I was just in the right place at the right time." Caroline looked at him. "You weren't just there. You came. Even though you had no right. Even though I hated you for 20 years. Robert looked down. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Caroline. I have no right." "I don't forgive you," Caroline said quietly. "For leaving. For Mom dying alone while you were hiding somewhere. I can't forgive that." Robert nodded. "I understand. But I am grateful," Caroline continued, "for saving me, for not walking away. You didn't come back into my life. You were just there when you needed to be. And that means a lot." Robert looked up. His eyes were moist. "It was all I could do." "Maybe, in time, we can build something new," Caroline said. "Not a father-daughter relationship, but something of our own. Something honest." Robert squeezed her hand. "I'd like that." They sat for a little longer, talking about life, about their plans. Then they said goodbye and went their separate ways. As Caroline walked down the street, she felt that something inside her had shifted. Not forgiveness, but acceptance. Acceptance that you can't change the past, but you can build the future. Dan, meanwhile, finished the remaining projects. The new contacts Caroline had found brought in stable orders. The company slowly but surely began to recover. Life was returning to normal. Beatrice never called again, never tried to make contact. She disappeared from their lives as suddenly as Robert had once disappeared from Caroline's. Dan sometimes thought about her, but he didn't call. He understood. It was better for everyone this way. 6 months later, Caroline found out she was pregnant. When she told Dan, he cried. For the first time in all this time, he allowed himself to show weakness. He hugged her and cried, repeating, thank you for everything." They sat in the kitchen, holding hands and making plans. The baby's room, the name, their child's future, a future they were building together. Honestly, without lies and manipulation. Caroline called her father and told him the news. Robert was silent for a few seconds, then said quietly, "I would be happy to meet my grandchild, if you'll let me." "I'll let you," Caroline replied. "It's a date," Robert said. Life went on, with its problems, joys, and challenges. But the main thing was that they went through it all together. Dan and Caroline learned to trust each other completely. They learned to tell the truth, even when it was unpleasant. They learned to protect their family from those who would try to manipulate them. And so ended the story of a wedding that almost became a trap. And began the story of a family that walked through fire and emerged stronger. A story where even those who had left long ago could return, not to ask for forgiveness, but simply to be there when they were needed most. And somewhere, on the other side of the city, Beatrice Foster sat in her house looking at a photograph of a young Dan. Perhaps, in time, she would understand her mistakes. Perhaps, one day, she would learn to love without controlling, to help without manipulating, and then, perhaps, she would have a chance to meet her grandchild. But that would depend only on her willingness to change and accept the rules that Dan and Caroline had set. The door was not locked forever, but she no longer held the key to her son's life. All that remained was hope.